Thank you to all of the hosts and the sponsors tonight. I really wanted to take this time to share a little bit about my journey in storytelling. I consider myself a young storyteller. A lot of the stories that I've understand or continue to have curiosity about and are starting to write is a huge inspiration. And I gather a lot of that inspiration through what I wanted to call tonight kindling. So if we can just go to the next slide. I did introduce myself, or Kim rather introduced myself. So just a few more things. I work with the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, and I volunteer a lot. Beyond teaching, I'm also doing a lot of other things on the side beyond creative writing. Next slide. So kindling, really getting into what that means. So tonight's, vision on tending to the fire. When you think about fire, you think about this enrichment, these beautiful colors, this beautiful warmth, and this really important element to how we, as humans, gather, how we utilize it, and how we live with things like this element of fire. But in order to get fire started, if you ever started a fire, the first thing that you have to do is gather kindling. And so in order to do that, when I think of storytelling, I also think of the way in which kindling can work to how we get inspiration to create stories, or rather to also share those stories. So for me, kindling is stories, lived experiences, ancestral knowledge, dreams, visions, questions of the unknown. So having that curiosity for things that we don't know yet, and really deepening the known. So furthering that curiosity into things that we know already, but we want more information, more details about. And then as well as imagination, the ability to create things. The next slide. And I really wanted to share with you a recent, there's quite a bit of stories that I have on the go, but one that I am really excited to introduce is my upcoming children's book titled Auntie's Red Surprise. So it's being published with Second Story Press in Toronto, and it should be out this early fall. I actually just got the final edit version, and it's going to be translated as well in Cree. So it's going to be hitting the printing books soon. So when I think about kindling and I think about this experience and this story, I think about what are some of the things that I drew inspiration from, or I had thought about before I actually got to the writing of the story. Oftentimes when you take a pen and a paper, or you take a notebook, or maybe your notepad, or your notes on your cell phone, there's often a striking moment, or that aha moment that you want to use to create a story. And for me, Auntie's Red Surprise, there was a couple of things that I consider were my kindlings, and it was being an auntie. I'm an auntie to beautiful nieces and nephews, and I often spend lots of time with them, and so it's just been a really big part of my life. And then also having dogs. I have 5 dogs in my home, and so you won't be able to tell right now. They're really, really quiet. My partner has them upstairs, but I do have 5 dogs at home that were rescued and I've had throughout the years. That dog on the left is actually a foster dog that we had, and it came from a res, and it's a tiny little res dog. So that's where the inspiration or the kindling came from. As well as teachings. In my upcoming book, I share a lot of teachings that I heard growing up and that I continue to hear about our relationship with our 4-legged relatives. Dogs are a huge part of Indigenous communities, and it's super important when we think about that work within our communities and that work within the relationships that we have and the kinships that we create with the environment as well as other beings. A huge part of that is our teachings through storytellings. And then I mentioned earlier, the book is being translated to Cree, and I'm very, very excited. It's being translated in the Y dialect, which is the dialect that my communities use. I'll go on to the next slide. So my kindling, so really playing off the word, I'm thinking about a fire, thinking about kindling. What can we use to look for? What are those little nitty gritty twigs, those fallen leaves, the little moss, the dried up grass patches. Sometimes people use paper. What is my kindling at reach that I can use to gather? When I started thinking about tonight and some of the kindling that I have, I thought about what better way to reach and gather kindling through the actual term kin. So tonight I wanted to share a story or stories that really are a part of me and who I become. And for me, the best way to share that story is by sharing a little bit about my kin tonight and how I use my kin and my ancestors and my being and my culture and my stories that were passed down to inform and to deepen my curiosity, which I begin to write with. And so these images that are popped up here on the left-hand side, I really wanted to share that this left-hand side image here is, you might not be able to see it, but I'll describe a little bit about the image. It's a very black and white image. It was actually probably the early 1900s. I don't quite know the date, but there is 3 women wearing headdresses and that are sitting on horses. Beside them, there's a Mountie or RCMP Mountie officer on his horse sitting beside them. And in the background, there's some Plains teepees. That image I found a couple of years ago, and it really struck to me on these beautiful women, particularly if you're from the prairies. A lot of, like, as a Nakota and as a Cree person, there's a lot of different teachings on how headdresses are maintained, who wears them, you know, what culture they come from. They typically come from the Plains communities and nations, both Cree and Nakota or Lakota, Dakota. And so I often am on one side of my community. I'm shared that, you know, women don't often wear headdresses. And so I was really informed in my life about that. But when I saw this image, or when I found this image, I looked to see who was in these pictures. And on the back of that picture, there was a writing, and it was my grandmother's writing. And the very, very left person, the young woman on the left-hand side, you can see the most, just that her name is Kajina. And Kajina is actually a great, great, great grandmother, about 6 generations back of mine. And so to me, that indicates she had great strength, great power, and great wisdom and knowledge, and had the honor to wear a headdress alongside these other 2 women. And so when I think about that story and that curiosity, and that really informed and helped me deepen my curiosity around my kin. The middle image there, it's again black and white. There's a gentleman and a woman, and that's Kajina as well. She's a little bit older in her older years. The man kind of standing behind her in the suit, his name was Wawashe. And Wawashe is the original translation for O Watch. My name is O Watch. It looks very Irish. It's not, doesn't have any Irish origins. It was actually a misspelling during the treaty assignments or the land, the annual payment assignments. So it went from Wawashe to Owatch. Somewhere along the line, an apostrophe got stuck in there, and voila, it looks like it is now. But it originally means Wawashe. And that was that name came from that gentleman in that photo in the middle there. On the right photo, you'll see about just a little bit over a dozen little images, little figures. And in those figures, you'll see older ladies, younger women, and children. You don't actually see men in that photo. And I often look to this image because I know this was also part of my grandmother's archives. All of these photos came from my late grandmother. She had a bunch of archives that she was collecting to try to recognize and understand and honor her own kin. And when she passed, I came across some of these photos. But that image there only shows women, and in that image there is a man in the middle. I don't know if he's a non-Indigenous man, a white settler, and I don't know what his role was, whether it was with the church or maybe with the township nearby. But there is only one gentleman in this image of these figures, and it's just that gentleman in the middle. And so I look to these photos and I often pull them out and reflect on them because they really bring curiosity about who I am, where I am, and how do I move forward and continue to inform my stories in a good way. I'm going to go to the next slide and show you a little bit about the other images. So like I mentioned, when I think of kin, I think of my ancestors. I also think of, on my mother's side, my maternal side, the first images were set on my father's Nakota side. These images are from my Cree or Nehio side. The image in the middle is of four gentlemen. All were brothers, and they were Chief Starblanket's sons. The gentleman in the trousers, kind of with the light colored trousers on, his name was Red Dog, and that was my grandmother's grandfather. Chief Red Dog. His dad was Starblanket, and his dad was Chief Wape Chief Wape signed Treaty 4 back in 1874 alongside other chiefs around this area. So in my direct lineage on my mother's side, there is a Treaty 4 signer, a really well knowledgeable chief who lived a long time, and his son also lived a longer time, Chief Starblanket, in this area and in this community in which I still, live in. On my mother's side as well, there's two images. They're the same lady and gentleman. Those are my great grandparents, James Tuckenow and Elizabeth Crow. In that one image on the far right, I don't know if you will be able to see it, but there's a valley. The Qu'Appelle River Valley is really important, and I'm going to show a couple more images, and I hope that from seeing these images, you'll see the importance that the valley means to me, because the valley actually is the middle intersection of both of my communities where they're situated today. My mother's community is on the more east side, and my father's kind of goes towards the west side. They're about 60 kilometers each from the valley, so they're kind of adjacent in the valley in the middle. The valley is called the Qu'Appelle Valley. It also is where Treaty 4 was signed. It's where the current Treaty 4 Governance Center is located, but it's also where the LeBret Indian Residential School was built, just south of Fort Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan. And all of my family, all of my parents, all of my grandparents, and these individuals in this image here attended residential school or industrial school or day school. And so I recognize the importance of that valley into some of my family history. The colored photo that you see on the bottom left-hand corner, those are my grandparents. My mother's parents, my grandfather and my grandmother, my Kukum and my Mushum. My Kukum Beanie and my Mushum Rami. And they were really, really special people. They had a lot of knowledge, and my Kukum was a huge, important person in our family as a matriarch. She passed away when I was younger, but there's a lot of stories and curiosities that I still continue to have this day in asking questions where I gained some knowledge on some of the things that she had or shared or witnessed. I'm going to go into the next slide. So when we think about kindling, we think about these stories. And for me, I shared a little bit earlier the types of kindling that you can gather from, or, types of fire starters, if you will, that you can really look towards as a storyteller of how to create or be inspired for your next story. My story, or my kindling, is my kinship, is my ancestors, my ancestral knowledge, the stories that they had, the lived experiences that they also had and that I continue to have. And that intergenerational experience of the land, of the environment, of culture, of ceremony, of language, and of a way of knowing in perspective. So when we think about kindling, we also have to think about, well, where do we see kindling at reach? So it's one thing to say visions when we didn't actually have a vision yet. So for me, my kindling at reach is the stories that I currently get passed down or I often engage with. The gentleman on the right-hand side in the picture with me, this was taken a few years ago, is my father. My father's name is Woodrow, and or Woody. And my father is a huge, huge storyteller. As a younger kid, I used to be fascinated with all of the stories he would share, and they really burned they really engraved and burned memories inside of me about some of the stories he shared growing up. And now, as an adult, as someone who is still curious about those stories, I often go back to him and I ask him about some of the stories he shared, whether they're ancestral knowledge, whether they're around ceremony, or whether they're around perspectives and different things. My father's a big storyteller. He talks a lot. He talks to anyone and everyone, and I think he's a fantastic storyteller. And a lot of the times when I do ask my father where he gets his storytelling, or where he learns his stories, rather, And as an active story listener himself, he mentions this man. The man on the left-hand side is my late Mitugash, my great grandfather, Doug Owatch. Doug Owatch was a young man, and he lived to a lot older, really old, and he actually passed before I was born. So I never actually met the man, met my great grandfather, but my dad was raised by him. So a lot of the stories that my dad has, he always refers to Grandpa Doug stories. And so a lot of times the stories that I share, or if I'm in conversation with someone orally sharing these stories, I'll say my dad's stories from my great grandpa Doug. And that's how I give recognition to the kindling that I'm gathering. I'm going to go on to the next slide. So when we think about kindling and kindling at reach, sometimes kindling isn't just, the immediate stories that we have or the immediate access to some of the stories. Sometimes that kindling at reach still needs to be gathered. And for me, when I think about ways that I often go out and gather kindling, like I don't, my interpretation of going out to the bush and gathering is really sometimes literally going out to the bush, going out on land, going out to environment, and engaging and being on the land. And that comes through visiting and gathering. So visiting out on the land, going out picking medicines, being a part of ceremonies on the land, or being a part of spaces, cultural spaces where short stories are being told. Now, I recognize as an Indigenous person that may look different for other people. But for me and my story that I'm sharing today, it's really about visiting and being on land as well to gather some of those kindlings that I have. On the left-hand image, you'll see a young girl. That's actually my niece, and we were out picking temshina. Temshina is a prairie turnip. If you're from the areas and down south, prairie turnips were a huge part of the survival of the Indigenous peoples, but also settlers coming to the central part of Canada. They are very, very useful, but they're also really hard to find. We know agriculture in Canada, in the plains, and the turning of soil creates a lot new plants and animals, but it also disrupts some of the natural plants and animals that were there as well. So temshina, or the prairie turnip, is really hard to find. It has to be like it's really tedious. It's really hard to find it. You can only find it during a certain time of year. And so that time, for the last couple of years, I was telling my dad, I'm really looking for this prairie turnip. I just had this curiosity after learning the story of the prairie turnip. And my dad told me last summer, come out, my girl, like come out, we'll go looking for it on a really hot day before the time of it comes and goes passes, because a certain time hits in the season in summer where it won't show itself again. It'll go back down. And I don't mean that in like a literal way. I mean that some ways that you identify the plant, you can identify it after a certain date just based on the season. And so I took my niece out, and it was really hot, and we went out for the whole day, and I spent the whole time with my dad and my niece. And so I just, the whole time I was in awe, because we did find the prairie turnip, and we picked it actually where my father said he picked it with his grandfather Doug. And so how that went full circle, that my father, the grandfather of that little girl, is now showing her where to pick it. And so we spent the whole day picking, my nails were getting dirty. I was in a shovel. I was just hot and sweaty and like just wanting to really find, but having to have patience for this plant to show itself. I spent the whole day sharing stories with my dad and learning more about the land. And that activity, that physical labor of looking for a plant and a medicine, actually turned into a day of stories. And a day of stories for my little niece, who's, under the age of 10, to hear and to understand and to hear those same stories my dad shared, which, brought my curiosity as a little girl. So that's part of that visiting and gathering. The middle image there is during a sunrise ceremony, equinox, the equinox for spring and summer, spring and summer and winter, usually, in the December month, and equinox in June, is a really important time for the renewal of the year for Indigenous communities. Not everyone, but most the ones that I'm from, The equinox is a huge part of our renewal of the year. So I was at a sunrise ceremony and I was wearing rubber boots and I had my skirt and I had my jean jacket. I didn't realize how cold it gets. I forgot, how cold it gets in the early mornings with the dew in the springtime. And I was out there again on the land, waiting for something to happen, something magnificent, for that beautiful sun to arise. But I was also out there listening to stories. Sitting out there with other women that day, we shared so many stories about so many things. And a day of visiting and a day of another mission became into another moment where I was able to gather some more kindling, some more curiosity around some of the things that I've witnessed and heard and experienced. The other image again is my dad. We were out in the fall picking sage. Sage has to be picked again at a certain time. You can't pick it past a certain time of year. And we were gathering again medicine and sage. And again, my father was sharing stories. And while we're picking there, having conversation, but really sharing some of the stories and the things that he's witnessed. So again, that picking of that activity became also an opportunity for kindling to come at my reach. And then on the very right-hand side is a good friend of mine. This is a very recent photo. A couple weeks back, I was actually at a storytelling gathering, and I believe it or not, I got asked to host the gathering. So I was in awe not only to host, but in awe to be around some really incredible storytellers and elders and knowledge keepers for a week. And my buddy there is a really incredible storyteller as well. So that was us. So when I think about kindling, where I have it at reach, how can I go out and get it? Look beyond just the reaching of some of these things and start to think about some of the stories or the experiences you had and where you first heard this story or you first felt this aha moment, because oftentimes that's where you're gathering that kindling. Those are those places and spaces in which some of that kindling becomes at reach for you. I'm going to go into the next slide. Another thing is land and territory. So I talked about being on the land with certain activities. Sometimes those activities just come from traveling. These lands and territories are the territories in which I'm from. This is the Capel River. Both of those fall images. You can really tell I like fall because I only take pictures of fall and spring, winter too, I should say. But the beautiful fall colors really catch my eye. And so land and territories, traveling out, going outside of the city or going into a beautiful city park and spending days out there. When you're on the land, you're often in thought and in thinking. And there's something special about that. Being on the land, being on a park, being in a park, being on the water, canoeing, or being at the beach, or being near the ocean, or, any place where you have access to that nature, that natural world, you can go and sit there and think and understand or have conversation, with people. Everywhere you go in nature and you see a gathering of people, oftentimes they're sitting there enjoying themselves, having conversations, sharing stories with one another. And so there's something special to be reminded about land and territories and the natural world, and where we often hear stories immersed and being talked about. So I think I wanted to recognize that as well. I'm going to take you to the next slide. Lands and territories traveled. Sometimes those lands and territories aren't your own. Sometimes they're not in the city park where you're from. Sometimes they're when you go on vacation or where you go for work. Both these trips, coincidentally, that I have here, these images are for work related images, but they turned out to be really incredible experiences that I really often think about and that I write down. I gather information and inspiration from, or that I share about my experiences in these lands. The one on the left-hand side is in Peshla, it's called. It's in South Dakota in the Black Hills. If you've ever been south of the border to Black Hills, South Dakota, or Rapid City, it's the ancestral birthplace of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples. So this is really the origin story of where my father, my paternal side, my community and my nation had come from. And so I was there for work, and just so happened that one of the hosts from the conference that I was at took us out on the land and took us to this exact spot and shared a story about that origin story. And I would have never heard of that story, I would have never been there and made that connection. Had I not said yes, I'll go to that conference. And so I really encourage you to think of some of those experiences you have or have yet to have when we think about kindlings and stuff where we gather some of those stories and that inspiration. On the right hand side, I was in BC and just near Harrison Hot Springs or Harrison BC, near Chilliwack. This is on the Stolo territory. And they have some really beautiful, beautiful waters, beautiful lands, beautiful culture, and beautiful stories. Stories that I'm not privy to share, but stories that I've had the beautiful privilege to witness. And again, if I didn't go for a work trip, I would have never had probably had visited that territory or heard those stories, or at least been able to sit here today and reflect on some of the beautiful experiences I had when I sat down with folks from the territory and chatted, just struck up a conversation and then started sharing stories of some of the things that we have in similarities. So I really, really encourage you, when you think about where your kindlings are and where you can gather kindling, these twigs, these grass, these mosses, think to the lands and territories. It doesn't just have to be at reach. It could be from experiences that you've already had or experiences that you're going to have. Keep that in mind as well. I'm going to turn to the next slide. And I'm going to share this part too, because I talked a lot about my ancestors, my kinship, and where I gather stories from, and where I deepen my curiosity of both the unknown and as well as the already known to me. But one thing that I often look towards, and I'm in deep reflection, is dreams. Now, sometimes people have. It's funny. It's one of the. Whenever I meet people, I also, in deep conversation, I go, "Oh, do you remember your dreams?" And sometimes people say no, and sometimes people say yeah. And for me, I remember a lot of my dreams. And so I think that there is a select few of us that can remember and a select few that don't. But a big part of my inspiration for a lot of the poetry that I write and a lot of the short stories that I'm creating or have written come from dreams. It comes from wanting to continue that dream. When you ever have a dream and you wake up and you're going, oh, I wish I could have kept sleeping. Well, you don't have to stop there. You can, write it down, open up your notepad, open up your phone, your notes from your phone, and write down the brief things that you remember in your dream. But then, you can add on to it or take little bits and pieces of it for reflection later. That can also be your kindling, is dreams, and they're free. They're at hand. You have them every night. If you remember them one day, you remember them. If you don't, well, you don't. You're going to dream the next day as well. So that's really when we think about kindling and different things that we can use for some of the inspiration to our stories. Think as well as dreams. The image is a book called The Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality. It's actually a second book to a previous book, The Knowledge Seeker. It's by author Indigenous man from Treaty 4 named Blair Stonechild. He's also a professor at the First Nations University of Canada. He writes a lot about knowledge and ancestral knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and particularly Cree knowledge. And I've read his book. I haven't finished it yet, but I've read really already in my reading of the book so far. I've written a couple of poems, and one of the poems I wanted to share with you is this poem on the next slide. I'm going to read it out loud. You may not be able to see it because of the way the slide's set up. And there's a moment in this book that they talk about how Star people, Star Nation, are an important part of our stories and our origin stories as Cree people. I've heard about this term growing up as well in different ways, but it's been a really, really big part of my curiosity and wanting to write stories about that, contributing to that thought and that narrative. And so I started writing this poem, and the poem is in the style called a pantoum. It's a quite a unique style. There's a lot of repetition. So you'll find that, and it's not published. So I'm sharing it with you today, and it's called The Longest Journey from Home. And I wrote this poem at a writing retreat last year while I was reading that book. And so I wanted to share this with you. So it's called The Longest Journey from Home. The lonely astronaut sighs. What if, we come from the sky? Are we lost and lonely? Ancestors describe our arrival. What if we come from the sky, star people from a faraway nation? Ancestors describe our arrival. Wasaki-check, help me get home. Star people from a faraway nation. No humans in the flood story creation. Wasaki-check, help me get home. Everyone is racing to get home. No humans in the flood story creation. Star people are my nation. Everyone is racing to get home. This is the longest journey I've known. Star people are my nation. Are we lost and lonely? This is the longest journey I've known. The lonely astronaut sighs. I wrote this poem, like I mentioned, when I had a deep curiosity for the things that I read in the book. And the things that I read in that book, in a certain part of that book, really resonated with some of the things that I've already come to hear in my, my sitting down and being an active listener to my father or to community, and just really having a curiosity for when we think about the concepts of star people. I'm not no expert, and I don't have that story or that privilege to share those stories. But my curiosity and my really wanting to understand, some of that helped me. That kindling of reading that moment in that book and those other stories really helped me ignite this, breathe air, breathe life into this poem. And so I've written this poem, and I think back at it a lot. I've shared it a few times with some friends and family. And there might be some adaptations in the future to the poem, but I really wanted to mention, you can, when you use your kindling, when you look to kindling, when you look to stories, wherever that is, whether it's in a book or it's in a story you heard 15, 20 years ago from, an old elder, or whether it's a story you heard on a bus station or driving or wherever you find your kindling, it can strike again, and that idea, that inspiration, and that feeling that you get can start something beautiful. It can ignite an opportunity to create something like a poem. And I just so happened to create it in this really cool style called a pantoum. I'm going to change it to the next slide here. So I have 3 questions I posed today, and I really wanted to talk and to talk to. And the first one is going back to the understanding of kindling. What can we use to inspire, to build curiosity, and to inform our writing, our art, and our storytelling? Storytelling isn't just through writing poems. It's not through writing short stories. Sometimes storytelling is just like sitting around and chatting and sharing stories and experiences, ideas. And storytelling comes in that form. It also comes in a form of art, drawing, painting, creating. And so storytelling comes in all many forms, and whatever form that you use to continue to share stories, the recognition that there's that aha moment, or there's that moment of seeing the kindling at reach, using it, gathering it, and helping it to inform and build curiosity. Storytelling is about building curiosity. It's about answering the questions that we have inside. It's also about wanting to deepen the things that we already know. There's a lot of times when we're curious, sometimes we say, "Oh, I don't know nothing," or "I don't understand." But actually, a lot of your experiences and your understandings help you inform that curiosity and build on it. So really deepening the things that you already know, or the things that you already have experienced and witnessed to help you build more curiosity around it. And sometimes, like I said, there's things that we don't know and we just have general questions. And so how can we use to inspire and build curiosity? We can use things like dreams, like I mentioned. We can use things like stories, lived experiences. When you have an experience, maybe you think about that experience, whether it happened in the moment or a few days later, or so long and so forth. wherever you have that experience in that story you think about, that is kindling at reach. That's kindling that you can go back and use, you know, you can go back and think about and write down or share or, you know, draw and create. Those are all a part of how the kindling that you use to in order to create and inspired to be to inform and to create that story or build that fire with. I'm going to go into the next slide. Inviting the flames. Why does deepening our curiosities matter? Why does deepening that want to work with some of the things that we already have at hand, you know, it's really about breathing life into them. It's about breathing life into those stories. I shared earlier in this presentation my ancestors, you know, images of them, because that's that's what the stories I know best. They're the stories that I have at hand. I recognize that the term ancestors and sometimes our connection to our kins, it's a complicated. It can be complicated, and it can be complicated because of the complicated history that we have, specifically when I think about the acts of colonization and when I think about other acts of history or the current ongoing effects of things such as war and conflict and violence and disconnection, even, you know, migration, things like that. So when we think about ancestors, or like today, me sharing my ancestors, I recognize that other folks may not have that. So what I invite for you is, if that's the case, is to think about the chosen family, you know, chosen family that you love dearly and are close to. And you can really use that also as kindling. Kindling's also about reciprocity and respect. It's about breathing in, deepening our curiosities to want to know, but also to want to be able to share. Deepening those abilities to respect the stories that we're learning and hearing and the things that we're witnessing or experiencing. And, you know, having respect for ourselves and how we share those stories. It's about having respect for our narrative as well. I'm going to go on to the next one. So tending to the fire, what happens when we continue to tend to the fire? What happens when we gather the kindling? What happens when we experience it or hear and reflect and write and start to write or start to create? What happens when we do that? And when we begin to share stories, we create narratives. We create our own narratives. We also create an opportunity to build on some things as well. And we ultimately pass on knowledge. Give me a second. I just have a sore throat. We also begin to pass on knowledge, and we honor ourselves as well as our ancestors. So hoping today that some of the things I shared with you and the things that I continue to write about, whether they're stories of those images or whether they're stories of the people in the images, or thinking to, you know, the time and space to which they lived, I hope that in some way I honor my ancestors by continuing to breathe life into some of the stories and the experiences that they've had. It's also important to share stories, because that's a huge part of being a storyteller. It's a huge part of being able to share a narrative to a further larger collective. When I think about one of the best places, and it's so ironic being able to speak today with this particular group, is a really, really good place to be, especially if you live urbanly like me. A really good place to be, to gather and to be around stories, is at a library. There's so many storytellers, there's so many stories in a library, and it's so important to see all of the many things that you can learn and experience by reading a book, or by, you know, watching a video in the collections, or going through the collections of the old archives as well. Those are really, really important places. Also, you know, community is an important place, and being able to share stories within community is an important place. So when we think about starting the fire, and tending to it, and tending to our ability as storytellers, our ability as people who share stories, it's really important that we continue to have that kinship and those relationships, but as well as um, those spaces for us to learn and to breathe and to understand and to create and deepen our curiosities, and to furthermore create and then share what we created. So yeah, that's a big part of how we tend to stories and to storytelling. I'm going to go to the last slide, which is my thank you slide. And I really wanted to take the next few minutes to really give a big thank you to the hosts, and to Kim and to Maxine. In my language, we say Panamaya, which is in Nakota, it means thank you, or Kananaskamitin, which is I thank you all in Cree, or just thank you. I really appreciate you folks for being here today. And I hope that through me being allowed to share some of my kindling, I offer inspiration, or at least have helped you feel and understand some of the other things that we can use when we want to start to create stories or to share stories, to really look beyond just a pen and a paper, but to really look beyond just us sitting there trying to think of things. Sometimes those aha moments come in different places. They come in places unknown. They come in territories that we're maybe just visiting, or they can be done at home when you're sitting with family, when you're picking wild turnip. Your fingers are getting dirty, and you're really trying to get something out of it. So I really, really appreciate and hope that today was a really good opportunity for each and every one of you to just to get to think about how you can tend to your own fire. So Pinamaya
Oh,
Kananaskamitan.
Miigwech, thank you so much. Heather, are you saying that we're all writers? Are you saying we should all become writers? Then who's going to
Storytelling
visit the library
create.
and read our writings? Can I just say this was so inspiring and such a powerful share of an Indigenous woman's voice on International Women's Day. What I have found in my experience is that oftentimes women's voices are a second choice. So today I celebrate matriarchy. I celebrate your share. I honor your ancestors. And I didn't say when I introduced you that the audience that's joined us today would have an opportunity to perhaps type into the chat a question that they might want to ask you. So if you're a fast typer and you've got something you want to ask, throw it into the chat. But I'm going to throw a question at you right now, just to kind of give people time to type their questions. We may not get through all the questions, I apologize, but we do have about 5 minutes to go through some Q&A. And so, depending on your replies and how long it takes, we'll see how many we get through. But my first question to you, because I found this really, really interesting. First of all, this is my own personal curiosity. What does this turnip taste like?
It's pretty bland. It's a between a turnip and a rutabaga. um,
Oh, okay, that's cool. I noticed how flat your landscape is, and I became very Ontario centric. Like, where's the trees? Like, it's just pretty flat. And then you talk about, this food that you can harvest and the relationships we have to the land, no matter what the landscape looks like, she provides for us. And so the honoring of our relationship through respect and love for our Earth Mother is really, really important and very typical of how First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across this country refer to what provides for us. But you talked about your upcoming book. So congratulations on that. Can't wait to hear about the release. But I was wondering why you chose to have it translated. Why is this like what should Canadians kind of pick up from this? Because I have found that many artists now are inserting Indigenous languages or actually having a full translated script available as well. So you want to talk briefly about that?
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking this question. I am extremely excited. I remember before I even wrote the story, I thought to myself, "Is I want to have a story about this inspiration, this kindling of being an auntie, puppies, things like that, and having these teaching moments." But I remember thinking, oh, I really want to get it done in Indigenous language. I want to preface that I'm not fluent in Cree nor Nakota, but I often think about my responsibility in when it comes to the involvement of language. So I hope that being able to have, and I appreciate Second Story Press for helping me find a translator in the dialect that I would like, and have that out there and being available, because it's so important that even if you don't speak the language, it's important that you do some work, you contribute to the work of creating sustainability and keeping that language around. And so I really, really hope that I help contribute in some way. And I continue to learn the language. I'm just, yeah, that's a big reason why I wanted to write it in Cree.
Oh my gosh, the questions and the thanks are flooding in, Heather. Some really, really good questions. And I think you've lit a fire under those that maybe wanted to be writers too. So, the first question I'm seeing here is, how do you deal with the fear of the blank page or the doubt in your writing? Because I know it happens for many. And in
Mhm.
my experience, when I did my books, I was like, where do I even start? And then, as you know, as an oral culture, we pass our stories down, from our lips to your ears. So this whole process of now writing it down and embracing our language as well, may seem seamless for us, but there are many I mean, we all have a story. So there are many who perhaps want to share that. So how do you deal with the blank page syndrome? Where do you start?
Well, there's times moments where I have it and I don't touch the paper for days, and there's or months even, and then there's moments where I just bam, bam, I have it all out and have two or three, chapters or two or three poems done or what have you. I think that really inspired me last year, I got involved in writing workshops. So there was actually one in Ontario that I went to, and it was virtual. It was through Firefly, I believe it was called. But I got involved in writing workshops, and then I applied for writing retreats. And you can get fine if they're in your area. You can apply to. I really encourage writing retreats. Yeah, they're really good spaces
Thank
to meet
you.
others.
Yeah. So some simple steps. Just start simple. Don't do the deep dive, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that reply. Okay, so I have another question for you. And this is, was there a dream you had that impacted you more deeply than the others? And if
Mm-hmm,
so, would you be open to sharing it?
mm-hmm. There's a lot of dreams that I had. Sometimes I have dreams that are Hmm. There's some dreams that I have that are very spiritual, that I won't share today, but there is a dream that I have that I often share with my brother, because my brother's a really big sci-fi fan, and I was having a dream about sort of an end of times, like apocalyptic, and it might have been because at the time I was watching a couple of television series that really stuck to me that had the same sort of vibe. So I had a dream about this sort of post-apocalyptic world and this like running and going through things. And I shared it with my brother, and I was like, we need to write a book. So me and my brother often write small short stories, and we share them, with one another. And I'm hoping that through more inspiration of these post-apocalypse sci-fi times turns into a small little book that me and him can publish together, because he has some short stories about some really cool things. So yeah, there is some dreams that I think about often and write for.
I'm so glad you talked about dreams. I think we undervalue dreams, and a lot of our visions, a lot of our inspiration, a lot of our work is directly tied to something that we saw or kind of interpreted or digested in the dream time. For Indigenous people around the world, it is a key component of how we move forward, how we decide for the greater good, what our next steps might be, or information that we feel is being transmitted to us from our ancestors or our descendants yet to make their appearance on the earth. So this was very, very powerful, and I love that tie into a dream. But we're coming very close to the close, and I want to offer one final question to you. Oh, and I want you to know somebody from Treaty One territory, Kayla, tuned in from Winnipeg. Thank you for putting that into the chat, because we were hoping to expand our reach. And I know that you reached out to your network and encouraged them to join in this evening. Maxine and I have a big vision, to bring a space and place for Indigenous, African, Caribbean, and Black voice in a really meaningful and yet intimate way. So this virtual series is a way to feel that intimacy and get to know the person behind the writings or the stories or the creative aspect. So, because it's International Women's Day, my last question to you is what is the one thing? I wrote it down because I want to get it right. And we know that we've struggled a lot in this country, but I want to know what is the one thing you really want our viewers, our listeners, to remember about us?
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
That's a good question. And there's tons of things running through my mind right now, but
Choose one, just one.
one thing that I would love for for viewers and listeners is to know that we have unique, diverse experiences, and that the concept of homogenizing is really painful and detrimental to the beautiful stories that each and every one of us have, whether that's lived experiences or what we write. You know, my story, my Cree book that's coming out, like in the Cree translation, it's different from, it's going to be different from any other writer who's writing about being an auntie. And so I really want to press that when we think of Indigenous or Black storytellers, that we have to recognize that we're not all the same. We all have different, unique experiences, and to really recognize that and keep that in mind when we're engaging with storytellers, but also when we're reading books or watching movies or things wherever whatever we create.
So beautiful. Such a great close to a really awesome and inspiring session. Thank you so much, Miss Heather Owash. I love that little teaching. I'm going to close with a couple of final words. Please buy our books, support Indigenous, Black, African, and Caribbean authors. Ask for them, go to your libraries, give them suggestions so they can grow their collection, and join us for our next session. We're really, really looking forward to this time together. We will be meeting on a regular basis. Tell your friends, your families, your coworkers, tell the entire street you live on to register and join us. It is free. It comes from our hearts to your hearts. Our goal is to change the world one heart at a time by reminding you that we're still here. On behalf of Ancestral Voices, Maxine Gordon Palomino, and myself, your moderator for this evening, Kim Wheatley, I thank you so much for being with us.